Twitter, please don't
Good
come,
evening.
it's sold out.
Apologies about the slightly late start. We're going to get underway. Thank you very much for coming on this beautiful summer's evening. Before I hand over to Janine di Giovanni and Susan Meiselas, who are going to talk about this wonderful new book on Eve Arnold, if just a few housekeeping rules. If I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Janine and Susan don't need much introduction, but I would just say Janine's an author and a journalist. She's currently working as editor of Newsweek and contributing...
Middle East editor
and Newsweek, and contributing editor to Vanity Fair. Is that stuff? Yeah. And she's just at the moment working on a book on Syria, which is going to be out this autumn. Susan's a documentary photographer, a member of Magnum Photos since 1976. She's also an author and is currently president and acting executive director of the Magnum Foundation. So before I hand over to the two of them, I'm going to ask Frank Arnold to come up and say a few words.
Thank you very much. It's really quite splendid to be here, and having seen the book in its various stages of preparation, I'm absolutely delighted with it. One thing that's probably less well known about Eve was the extent she had to take risks in relation to her work. And you can see one example in the series that's been running there, where she was photographing members of the American Nazi Party, and where she wound up burnt all over her clothes with cigarette butts as she moved through the crowd trying to harm her. Also political risks, so that in the earliest stages of her career, she photographed Joe McCarthy at a time when it was not entirely popular so to do, at least not from her perspective. And she managed to make him look seriously ugly. She managed also not to get this published anywhere in the US. She was very proud when she came home with a copy of Stern, and she didn't read German, unfortunately, which would run a huge spread, I think 8, 10, 12 pages. But to her horror, when the article was translated for her, they'd converted it into a pro-McCarthy story. The point, I suppose, is this. Photojournalism is not without its risks. And you can see a little bit of that in Eve's work, but I think you can see a lot more of it, for example, in Janine's, in Susan's, and a lot of other Magnum photographers. And it is essential that people do document the horrors of the world around us, and that is one of the things at which Magnum, of course, is expert. I'd just like to say that one of Eve's wishes was that there be an addition to the Magnum Foundation in support of photojournalists, their helpers, their families, who are at risk of gross human rights violations for the work they do. Thank you.
What's happening? Oh, we're mic'd. Oh, Frank, thank you. First of all, it's very moving to have Frank here. It's very difficult to talk about Eve without Eve here. So I wanted to, thank you all for being here and thinking about someone who nearly was 100, not that long ago, and was with us. And give you a little context for this project, which is the first of a series of books. The Magnum Foundation was formed by Magnum photographers when they turned 60, which was 7 years ago. And so the idea was that the photographers felt like time was changing, a lot is changing, the conditions are changing. We wanted to be able to both honor people who are passing and perhaps their work is forgotten, and recontextualize that work so that you get a feeling of the lives that were around the famous photographs, and also create a fund for emerging photographers, part of what Frank was talking about, which we do each year. We give somewhere between 10 and 12 small grants for travel and continued work, which is the hardest thing to do in today's context. And third, use the Magnum Archive in a creative fashion to really partner in new ways with existing material. So that's kind of the landscape within which we began the idea of a legacy series. and Eve was the first woman, though Inga and Eve didn't duel about that, but one was in France and one was in New York, so they both were first in one sense. And it just seemed right. Eve's work had gone to Yale. We were really interested in this relationship between the archive, outside of memories people have, and then also what notes, and Eve was a great writer, as you'll hear more about, the way in which she thought about her work. And she wrote a great deal in her monographs, but we wanted to really see the process, the raw process. As you see about some of these images, but for example, there's a contact sheet. This is a book that really opens up process, or it tries to. It really tries to give you a feeling of how she began and where she went and what it took to get where she went, etc. So I wanted to start by, we're going to have a very fluid conversation, no prep, just we called Janine up one day. She was recommended because Frank knew Janine had known Eve, and we called Janine up and said, well, you write for Newsweek, you write for Vanity Fair, you run around the world 12 times, but how about doing a biography, which means there's an archive. And I think it's been challenging and exciting and a new form for you, and I just thought it'd be great to hear where you began with this and reflecting back, because it now exists, which is always a great moment. Something about that process of discovering Eve.
I'm not a biographer. I'm a long-form journalist, and I write books mainly about. I'm sorry for my voice. I woke up this morning with a lost voice, so you'll have to forgive me. Eve has always been a hero to me. When I started out during the first Palestinian Intifada, so the early 80s, there were very few, late 80s, there were very few women that I could look to as role models who had managed to make their way into this very macho, I think we could say it still is pretty macho, world of foreign correspondence, of reportage, of war reporting, even though I wouldn't say Eve was a war reporter. But she was one person I had always admired. And I'd met her several times very early on in my career when I was working at the Times of London, trying to convince her to go on assignments with me to Algeria and other places. And we would go to the Chelsea Arts Club or to various other places for lunch, and she would advise me about work, about life, about motherhood. And really for me, she was one of the few people that I could look to who had a map, where to go. The process of the biography was complicated. The archives, first of all, Frank was extraordinary because he allowed one rainy afternoon, I couldn't get a babysitter for my son, and I dragged my son along to poor Frank, and Frank had boxes and boxes and boxes that he was about to ship off to Yale. And Eve, I think it's fair to say she was a hoarder. I mean, she kept everything. I've never seen such a collection of, and she was very organized, but even within there was just so much. She kept notes on who she was having lunches with. Her diaries were very methodical. I found myself in her diaries several times with old phone numbers I don't even remember I had. Her letters, of course, her letters to Frank, her letters to Jane, her letters to Isabella Rossellini. So this treasure trove, and her cameras. So Frank left me upstairs for a couple hours, and it was a bit like being a child in like a kind of childhood fantasy of going up into someone's attic and finding all these trunks and unraveling a life. So I kind of had this vision of doing it that way, which is how I really do all my work, is throwing myself into it and seeing where it took me, you know, kind of, as Susan and I sort of said, flying by the seat of your pants. But this had to be done very progressively and very, in a very pragmatic way, very academically as well. Is Andy here tonight? No, he's not. So Andy, Susan.
So we should just say
Frank?
Andy Lewin really made it possible to do this kind of work because it meant subsidizing a certain amount of research, which was quite intense on Janine's part, and an additional graduate student. So Andy Lewin was the person
Conduit.
behind, the channeler, the connector, and of course Prestel becomes the publisher, but that's later. We're just diving into process and seeing what we find.
And Andy was that kind of rare thing, a corporate lawyer who loves photography with a passion. So he was really helping us make this possible. And then we had this brilliant graduate student, Tessa, who could do what I could not do, which is, take the index cards and sit. And together we sat. I think I did it for 10 days, and that for me, I sat in the library with the index cards. She sat there for 2 months, 3 months more, photographed phone, doing the really serious cataloging. And the extraordinary thing about Eve, which most of you know because you're here to honor her, is that she was so prolific. And the more we went through the storylines, the more came out. And I send these friends back to Frank or Susan or Andy saying, well, wait, the trip to China, or was the Mongolian, the picture of the girl and the horse in Mongolia included in which story? And so it was really a process of unraveling a life. And it was absolutely beyond fascinating. I think for me, I've written 6 books. It was one of the great highlights of my life. It was poignant, and it also was so inspiring, because we were talking earlier, and I said to Susan, she was so persistent. She never gave up. I mean, she spent how many years trying to get a visa for China? Frank, like 7 years to try. 9 years to get a visa for China.
And finally went in 1979, so she still went ahead of the cusp. And of course, I'm remembering her in the photographer's room, which is the one place in each of the Magnum offices where photographers come and go, and piles accumulate if they're not there of mail or whatever. And she would have her little piles about China, her map, her drawing. She was working at the time on the America series, which also was a very elaborate map of America, and placing herself very specifically in different...
With the Indian, with the Native Americans, and the other thing was the depth of her work. I mean, she could do, it's almost cliche to say, but she could do the Marilyn portraits, but then she could spend one of her first assignments when she got to Britain, which is one of my favorites actually, is the time she spent with these young girls who were flatmates in Kensington. And she would dive into a subject and spend so much time. I mean, nothing was rushed. Nothing was what journalism has become now, and we'll talk about that. But for her, it was the art of sitting down with people, spending time, investing an extraordinary amount of energy and time. And I remember Frank said something to me, and Frank was such a huge help in this, because his memories of her as not just as a mom, but as a woman, as a photographer. He helped her edit. And you once said something to me which really struck me, which was that she was very tiny, as you know. She was under 5 feet tall, just 5 foot tall.
That was important to her. She made it 5 foot.
Just 5 foot. Extremely elegant, extremely elegant. I mean, I think one of the last things I saw her in the nursing home was, you cut your awful. And what are you wearing? And she was so elegant. But that she used her size and her femininity to get things that she might not have been able to get. And this combined with the persistence and the determination, and of course, the God-given talent, which is a big part of it. But I just have to say how honored I was to work on this. And Magnum, of course, in my 25 years as a journalist, the best work I've ever done has been starting with Susan in Nicaragua when did we meet? 1990? And I was like a kid, and she put me on the back of a motorcycle to go to the airport and said, take her to the airport. Magnum photographers, of course, are the creme de la creme. There's nothing and no one better. And
But you know, one of the things
That
that
was part of-
interests me, because I'm thinking about how much has changed since Eve's time, and we're going to float in this conversation in and out of that, I'm sure, because I'm thinking of Janine, and we, of course, not worked in the field together because we're not exactly,
Nicaragua.
but I mean really working on a story together.
For you.
And that's also a broken link in what used to be, and what was pretty exceptional. She wrote a lot of her own stories for the Sunday Times,
Yeah.
which was really unusual.
She's a very good writer.
She and barely get my captions and my notes together, but the whole idea of working with a writer in the field is really a loss to the field. We don't do that as much as we used to do. Long term, two people thrown into a situation to just figure it out from a visual and contextual relationship.
Which I miss so much.
It's
We've
a big
tried.
loss.
I mean-
I'm sure the Frontline Club talks about this almost every week. It's a big, big loss for the field.
I mean,
but
Alex
I think on the other
Maioli
hand, Eve
and I were a team
was so
for so long.
unusual because she went on her own and she wrote. And many of the stories we have, you know, tear sheets in the magazines, are her own writing. Not. She also worked with writers. And the other thing that's interesting about, I think you can see in this work, which is just a random sampling of some of the work that's in the book, and obviously not the archival work, except for that one contact sheet, which is what I particularly love in this book, is you see
Yeah.
which frame she chose, and you might wonder why, but you can think about that, or her actual file notes, etc. These filing cards that Janine was just talking about, these index cards, which were, for example, when she did Behind the Veil, she had an index card for absolutely every idea that she wanted to make sure she, you know, checked off on the list when she was filming and thinking about building a filmic structure. One of the things I think is interesting about you see in the variety, and Janine, you just referred to this, is the enormous diversity. So she would take an assignment and almost go anywhere, probably Frank, probably more than you would have loved her to have been around him more. I mean, and there's always that tension of you're a single mom, I don't know how you do it. You know, that's a real choice in life, and how tough that is to but she would either take an assignment, return someplace she'd been, or she would carve out her own projects. So in this book, you really get the feeling of how she just happened to get, she was part of the Misfits. There were 6 or so Magnum photographers. One that develops the special relationship with Marilyn that goes on for.
And that was her thing. I mean, she could, I mean, developing trust, as every journalist and photographer knows, is the biggest thing you can do to get a great story. I mean, Susan spent in Kurdistan, and the result of it is her masterpiece. And I can't work unless I can spend time sitting on the floor with someone, drinking tea for months on end, getting their stories out, which is why, and this is a whole other issue, Vice News, the Huffington things are, you know, to me, the devil. They've destroyed our noble craft. Eve, I wanted to talk also about her personally, and I hope Frank doesn't mind, like, the loneliness of these trips. And I cannot stress enough, because now that I can no longer work with my beloved Magnum photographers, and for the longest time I was teamed up with Alex Maioli, who, is he still the president of Magnum?
No.
Who,
Martin Parr.
Martin Parr.
What a change.
Alex Maioli
Italian
is
to English,
Italian,
very different.
wild, and we were together, we were a team for years, and then suddenly Vanity Fair would say, you go and, you know, we'll get the photographs a different way. Newsweek now, you know, I have to beg, borrow, and steal to get photographs in. I'm trying to change that. But Eve went alone, and I'll never forget her telling me about China. I remember in those days, I mean, now you have a lot of young Arabists who are working on the Arab Spring, and they speak the language, and they've come of age as journalists, not because they're journalists, but because they're primarily Arab speaking, and then they became journalists. It's great. But Eve would go to these places, Russia, China, even though she was of Russian descent, and she didn't speak the language. She was a tiny woman. This is before digital cameras, so she had huge, huge amounts of gear. She had back problems. And she was, in one trip, she told me that she got sick with pneumonia or pleurisy, and she ended up in a kind of clinic in some remote part of China, completely by herself, having acupuncture treatments, cut off from the world. And this is before internet, it's before cell phones, it's before satellite phones. So her letters home to Frank, to her friends, would arrive months after what she was going through. So I think you have to put yourself, when you see, that's my favorite photograph, that one and the first 5 minutes of you have to put yourself in her shoes and imagine the absolute tenacity, courage, bravery, and also just fearlessness of doing this in a time when women did that.
Well, that's a perfect picture to just kick off on. Because
that's fabulous, right?
This is fabulous.
Yeah, fabulous.
A black fashion show in Harlem, 1951, I think, something like that. She is
right
just
after
beginning.
She, course,
she was
yeah.
just beginning, and she, it was one of the, you know what I love about that story is how she found out about the black fashion.
She did it herself because she had just finished doing a course with Alex Brodovich at the New School, and she wandered off by herself to Harlem.
But it was her nanny, Frank's nanny,
Yeah.
who told her about the black, fashion show. Very creative solution. Actually, Brodovich had said, do something surprising, and believe me, that Fabulous, which is her true name, was her true name, was fabulous.
Didn't she come to her memorial, Frank? Was it Fabulous that came, or someone came, one of her?
No, the daughter of the man who introduced her to Fabulous.
The daughter of the producer of Fabulous. Mm.
So, I mean, the diversity of her work, I wouldn't put her in the category of a war photographer, but then again, I mean, I hate when people put me in the category of a war reporter, because I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter. But I think, again, you have to think of what it took to go from one project of hers that I love was, again, one when she was just starting out, when she was living on Long Island with baby Frank and her husband, and she went to a maternity hospital in Long Island, and she had just suffered a miscarriage, and she was depressed, actually, and she began this photo essay on the first 5 minutes of life, or of mothers with their babies. And it's probably one that most of you have not seen because it's her most famous, but it's one of my favorites because it captures in it the most raw emotions, which comes from her spending months and months in hospital and with the doctors and with the nurses and with the mothers. And remember, for us writing the biography, which is why, without making it too much of a plug, you must buy it. So much of this is in there because she wrote everything down. She had everything archived, albeit in quite a scattered way, but everything was, I think about the 70s when she started typing stuff, but that was another big project. Tessa and I had to decipher her handwriting, which was a big job, but
I would actually, you said that, and I just remember, I love the very first quote in this, which is, what do you hang on the walls of your mind? It's just an amazing quote. I mean, it opens the book, but it's so, one of the things that happens when you knew someone, and then you think of all the things you didn't ask them, and that's the hardest part of this, So for me, as a younger photographer, and hearing stories about what Eve had done, and forewarnings of thinking about what I might do. But I never asked her about all the formats she used, or what led her to do film at a certain moment in time, or why she worked with Rolleiflex and worked in black and white and then shifted to color. Some things that are really about photographers wanting to know about process. You never have time to
what
sit
did you
and
ask her about? Because she was a mentor to you.
She was in when I came into Magnum, it was in New York, and Eve happened to be in New York at that period, and there were a number of other women who were in Magnum, no longer in Magnum, sadly, Mary Ellen Mark and Abby Heyman, who you may not know of, Jill Friedman, who had just done an important body of work about circuses, and Eve was the elder. I'm sort of the elder now. But I guess I'm the kind of elder woman within Magnum. But she was actually one of the things the first thing I think she said was something like, "Are you in a relationship?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I hope it lasts." And
She was brutal.
she got right to the essence of it, and that's a whole nother part of the gender story of, wives hang around more than men sometimes, but that's, in my case, we did have a very long relationship with my partner.
Did she inspire your work? I mean, when you were doing Kurdistan?
I don't think there was any direct link in that sense. I think it's part of what you touched on, which is this. I don't know how different it is for the generation today, because there's something about access to the world without having to go there, which is a very strange experience, and I really profoundly. I think one of the most identify, probably, though Jean actually been sent somewhere together to work for someone together, etc.
We will be.
We always dream it, but we know what that process is. You're going somewhere, you really don't know what you're going to find, right? You may be partnered or not. That loneliness that you're talking about. I think that the willingness to put yourself into that of leaving what's familiar and going to what's foreign, whether you speak a language or you don't, you're starting from scratch, and you have no idea how it's really going to work out. If you will come back with the story or a set of photographs that, for Eve, I mean, she was on staff for the Sunday Times for many, many years, and so she had a guarantee of space if she did come back with photographs. Well, most of us going out now have no guarantee of space. And if there is space, they pay nothing. So those conditions are radically different than Eve's when she was working. But the stamina, the determination, that waiting 9 years for a visa, believing that she wanted to be one of the first women photographers to go to China, that she shared. That was inspiring, and you felt that in every bone of her.
Yeah.
Never stopping.
And she had a lot of integrity. I mean, like all of us, at some point we have to do things we don't want to do to earn money. And she and I were both, we weren't single mothers because we had men who produced the children with us, but had to earn a living. And Eve did, but she would never work for, there was one letter I found where she was going to Switzerland to shoot a cigarette ad, but she would never work for any gun firms. There were she had clear things that she would absolutely never do, even if she needed the money, even if she was, going through her cash flow sheets. And I think for me, looking back on her life, and whenever a young journalist or photographer comes to me and says, how do I do this? I think of her determination. And, if you want to do something, you will do it. You'll find a way to get into China. It might take 9 years, but you will do it. You'll find a way to get to Damascus or Afghanistan, or you'll find, and Susan and I will talk about this later, the grant to do the project on malaria or Ebola or whatever. The other thing about her that I really admired was that she had this 3-part system, which she told me about, but then which I learned a lot about when I was going through the archives. And it's systematic, and of course she had the wonderful Linny. Is Linny here tonight? Yes. Where's Linny? Oh gosh. Well,
Linny should be right here.
Linny should be, we can't tell this story without Linny, because Linny was a friend of Frank's from Glastonbury, or some concert, and she went to work with Eve very early on, and basically, you'll have to, really did the archiving and the system and got everything going so that Eve could go from one story to the next. But as I would go through, and also I have to go back, and when I'm talking about the methodology of writing the biography, my primary resources for it were my primary sources, meaning the interviews I did. So I think I did about 50. I think I got about 50 people who talked to me at length about her. And, without Linny, who had all these wonderful stories of Eve and details, about how she who she entertained, which is very important to piece together a biography because it's all parts of her life. She wasn't just an extraordinary photographer. She was a mother. She was a cook. She was a friend. She was an entertainer. I mean, she had all these different facets of her life. But anyway, back to the three system. She would be researching, then traveling, then editing. And as soon as one project finished, she'd be on to the next. So she'd be, waiting for the visa for China while researching Behind the Veil, while at the same time looking into going back to the Ukraine to rediscover her roots. And so there'd be several things going on at once, but it was all very carefully orchestrated. And I find that very admirable. It's something I have not mastered. Have you been able to do
Well,
this?
if you have a Linny.
Yeah.
Truly. I mean, I imagine this is a strange conversation to both bring in because I haven't seen Linny in many years, but I was thinking about how carefully you packed all those boxes that went to Yale and how intimate a process that is for anyone at the end of their life, coming towards their end of their life, to revisit their life, to figure out what really matters, right? And to create some notion of order that then is going to go to an archive and live with strangers poking around, right? And Eve was very generous in sharing letters, some of which are pretty
Private.
tough. Some are very private, some are tough. There's some letters of exchanges with editors, magazine editors. I don't know if Linny remembers these.
And
but
she could be really
she
harsh.
was really fighting about rights and
Money
the rights
and-
of photographers and defending the rights and taking people on who put her at risk to not work for them again. Let's face it, we all know that that's true. But how, I don't know, Linny, for that whole process of packing and then it's gone, and then the space that she's lived in for so long with everything is also gone. It's empty, which is a very complicated process to emotionally move towards. So Linny hasn't seen this book yet.
No.
We just got this book
We just-
literally about 4 days ago in New York, and they just arrived here. So received her copy, and Frank hasn't seen his copy, though they may have seen parts of things in process. I wanted to read a quote because you were talking about China, and I just was flipping through and I saw this, and I thought it would give you all a sense of. She says, "Think in Chinese, look in Chinese" is the title of this chapter that Janine wrote. I must look at China in her own perspective, remembering her history, trying to understand her character, and being totally aware of her needs. I must try and not judge by my Western eyes, but must try and think in Chinese, look in Chinese, while still retaining my own point of view.
Hey,
I mean,
yeah.
That's just, we all have to do that just right out here on the street. We don't have to go all those miles away, but how one puts oneself in someone else's place of life and tries to empathize, read, represent. It's such a powerful process, whether it's in words or it's in photographs. When this picture, which you probably all can see, was the portrait that was the poster for the big show at the Brooklyn Art Museum, and everyone thought it was Eve. And actually, at a distance, Frank, you would agree, it looks a lot like Eve.
Worse than that.
Yeah.
She took a taxi from the taxi driver, for some reason, seen it.
Wait.
And said that was a terrible photograph of you.
Great.
The difficult thing about writing it was that there were so many extraordinary quotes and stories and things that people told me that to narrow it down to, I can't remember how many words there were, but not many, 20,000, 30,000.
35,000.
35,000.
You managed 35,000, yeah.
But it could be 150,000 because every single one of, and the boxes, I mean, I talked about the boxes after because when, first from Frank's house, pulling stuff out, which, sometimes call down to him and say, "What's this?" And he'd be like, "Oh, that's, a family picture of a picnic from this and this and this." But then when we were at Yale, going through this stuff, sitting at these tables in this extraordinary library, and pulling out her letters to John Huston or Angelica Houston or Isabella Rossellini about her love life, and it was so extraordinary because it really was recreating an entire life.
But I know. I really want to. I almost want to hand out all these books because you can't appreciate this by screen. But here's a countries in which I photographed, and it's a long list. It's just a list. This is what you find in an archive, right? So, the United States, 1950 through 1985, off and on. Jamaica, 1953, 3 weeks. Cuba, 1954, 1 month. Haiti, 1954, 1956, 6 weeks. England, 1961 through until present day. Haiti, 1 week, etc., etc. You know, this is sort of the character of an archive that opens up a life. And Tessa, who is the young graduate student who was working on this, she not only she's fascinated by the fact that she was propelled by a curiosity to learn about and convey the character of a country. She first employed this approach in England. She goes on towards this my own mad conscientiousness is what Eve refers to with her immersive work. Which, you know, being conscientious about keeping track of where she's been and what she's done. And
I think another word we've forgotten to mention, which is probably the most important, is curiosity.
Yeah.
And I mean, to me, that says it all about her. I mean, it was just this kind of, it takes a lot of guts, even now, to get on a plane with your bags, not know where you're going, land at an airport, work your way out about what hotel you're going to go to, where you're going to sleep, how you're going to find a translator. But I think she was propelled by this extraordinary curiosity to find out about the country, the people. I mean, she really was an anthropologist in many ways. And she wasn't educated in the traditional sense. I mean, she did go to university. She studied accounting, didn't she? She wanted to be a doctor like you, but
She got a very, very short period of treatment, less than a year.
but she was completely self-educated, and everyone, I mean, she was this wonderful kind of sponge. Everyone, she politician, she drew an education from. So
here's a perfect index card education, right? I'm just, because, you know, I've seen it, but it's in conversation with what Janine's remembering, and she doesn't have the book in her hand, but Manners and Customs of the Ruala Bedouins.
Oh, yeah.
The Bedouin is most happy from the 8th to the 18th night, for the moon in that period is still alive at sunrise. These nights are called the white. The Bedouin cannot then be discovered from afar, nor suddenly attacked from nearby, as he sees farther than the rifle would carry. Beginning with the 8th, might he sleep easily. From the 10th onwards, he need not drive to gather the camels, which lie here and there around his tent.
It's very poetic.
That is on a file card.
Yeah.
And each one of these has another little moment that she'd, you know, again, a lot of this particular section is from Behind the Veil, which is one of the things to say about that is that she shifts from doing photography in a harem. This is before the existence of the UAE.
70s.
So it's in the 70s before it becomes a country. And she gains access to a marriage ceremony. Today, in the UAE, these are the most valuable photographs because they were completely unknown to the culture themselves, what a harem was like within, you know, the monarchy, etc. So it's the it's sort of stripping back and the work coming back to the culture that she covered without, it's only become more valuable in time.
The cornucopia of objects we found in those boxes, I mean, for Behind the Veil, we found a recipe for a wedding cake, a Bedouin wedding cake. And I really wanted to put it in the book. I think Andy and I had a little argument about it because he didn't want to. And I said, we've got to do this because she was a great cook. And I remember grilling Frank about what exactly did she make really well. And in the end, we did put the wedding cake recipe, but she recorded everything. And it's very funny because I went back, and I had my interns who work for me begin to take, because I had my notebooks thrown all over the place, 25 years of notebooks, and I made them begin to archive them. Not that I'll ever, be Eve Arnold, but I wanted it to be in order because I realized that her work was so important, and as documentation, as a kind of, as a Claude Levi-Strauss. I mean, she went, she watched, she observed, she recorded, she documented, and it was all primary. It wasn't done from the way journalism is done now, which is unfortunately someone sitting in New York at a desk at the Huffington Post writing an article based on 10 reports. And
or it's Twitter feeds.
Well,
I really want to, we're going to
will
open
get
up
to
to
that,
questions, but I just would love to read you because it's speaking exactly to something that you capture in this quote too. I seem to be in a state of suspended animation back to China, unable to make anything happen for my Chinese trip and unwilling to settle for anything less. This kind of stagnation comes every couple years and is apparently a need on the part of my psyche to slow me down, but I find it irksome. It's just so, the language, and this is quite poignant because we were talking about freelancing. She has a card that's titled Freelancing, and I want us to end with this and open up to anything else people want to hear about, but she writes, feel bereft when a project ends. Like all the attention and concentration is gone, like a child that is grown up and gone away, and suddenly you are alone. Right on, freelancing.
meaning
you just
do it.
live on.
You just keep
figure
going.
it out. You juggle.
just do-
You invent.
One-
You recreate yourself. And, there are many, many stories here, quotes and whatever, but I think we should let people ask
Yeah,
them
we
what they
should.
want to know from you.
There's just one quick thing I want to say about that, because you brought up at the beginning, which is the motherhood thing, and
Yeah.
especially for the women in the audience. I couldn't work out how she did it, because it really isn't a very impossible task. And today, taking the train over from Paris, I always see these. I think they're perfect little families. 2 kids, husband, wife, and they're all together. She said to me once that she was going off on a trip, maybe it was China, and she missed you so much that she locked herself in the loo at Heathrow and cried before she went on a trip. And the kind of balance of like loving her child so much, which she did, and doing the work and leaving behind this extraordinary body of work which will live forever. I remember when I had my baby, someone said, now you are immortal. And I thought it was, no, not really, but the work is immortal. The work will carry on forever. So anyway, we will leave it to you now.
Yeah, the idea of a conversation was to include you. So anyone might have a comment to add. Linny, I'd love if there's something that brings up that you think we haven't obviously touched on, the enormous amount of hours that you spent with Eve, and
Years.
please, years.
It was years, but it was really all there. I just did what she asked me to do. She was extremely organized, and she never took a day off that I can remember, and she certainly never took a holiday apart from once, and she didn't like it.
Where'd she go? Where did she go on the
She
holiday?
went to Malindi, I think. Wasn't it, Frank, with the 2 women photographers? Yeah, Kenya.
In Kenya.
Yeah. She didn't like that aspect. She was always working if she went anywhere, so she
We
felt
know that
very
problem.
uncomfortable. Yeah.
Usually a child helps you have a vacation. Frank, is that really true? No. No vacations?
No.
Wow.
Okay. She never whinged, though, did she? She was not. The amazing thing about her, she never whined. I've got back pains. I've got this job with the Sunday Times. My editor's treating me. She didn't do that, which is extraordinary because it's kind of our national pastime.
Well, she didn't write it so that you could find it. She might have said it, though. There's someone back
Just
there.
curious
Sorry.
if you know that she had mentors, and also maybe whether she knew and was a friend of Lee Miller.
That is interesting because is Anthony Penrose here by any chance? He said he might come. Because Lee was also someone I was greatly inspired by. And they were similar in some ways, but in other ways they were very different because their lives ended differently, and I don't want to get into that. But I think that her mentors were her first teacher from the New School, Alex Brodovich, who was a great Harper's Bazaar art director. But I think she winged it. I mean, I think she basically went out. I think she was friends with Kappa. She was friends with Cartier-Bresson. And in her correspondence, she was always very civil. I really tried to find bitching, about... There were a few things, going on at Magnum that she wasn't happy about. But no, I mean, I don't think there was a significant... I don't think we could say Cartier-Bresson mentored her, or I think Brodovich pushed her in the direction. But, she was basically a Long Island housewife that went out with her cameras and did this on her own. So again, that goes back to not everyone has the tenacity that she had. She was quite an exceptional human being. But I think that in that time, too, who would have been her mentor? Dorothea Lange? Dorothea Lange was a different generation.
This is the thing, I think, Eve does begin photography when she's nearly 40. So you forget, that's all embedded
1951.
here. But it's very early days for Magnum. Magnum begins in 1947. So the first founders of Magnum, Cartier-Bresson, Robert Capa, George Roger, who is a friend, but he's in Africa, and Capa's in China. And the world, Cartier-Bresson is, based in Paris, but moving to India and other places. So I think the image that I have of Magnum in those early years, reading documents and letters even from Eve, is a small group of people. There's literally a letter that says, "We'll just divide up the world. Will you take that continent and I'll be on that?" It's an astounding assumption to me now, with millions of eyes everywhere. Who would ever presume? But it was of a certain time. It was post-war, so there weren't. Whether or not she had a relationship with Margaret Burke White, I have no idea if they knew.
Wasn't
of each
in the
other.
letters. I did. I searched for.
Nothing so direct the way now we have this elaborate network in which people intern and, study with and take workshops with. That kind of a network just totally didn't exist. So she may have met Dorothea Lange.
Also, mentoring is a
Frank,
new
do you have any idea if she met any particular... she was very close to Inga Morath, but Inga was based in Paris, and it's not like Skype. You just, you didn't see each other very much.
And Inga had Inga was very privileged. Inga had a totally different life than Eve was. Much more hardworking and much more disciplined. And Inga was married to Cartier-Bresson. She was from
She wasn't married.
Oh wait, sorry. They weren't married?
No, but you're not. You're going to have to read the third book in the series if you're interested.
Arthur Miller.
Arthur Miller.
Yeah.
She stole Marilyn. She stole Arthur Miller away from Marilyn Monroe. That's the third book coming up. It's going to take 3 years, though, so don't rush.
She had a much more privileged life than Eve, I think.
Well, different. European life, very, very different life. Also a very gifted writer. We're just beginning. Francine Prose is just committed to doing the work with Inga Morath. The second volume, by the way, is it's not all women, though. We're taking advantage of the few to lead. The second book is Bruce Davidson, which will be in a year. Vicki Goldberg is writing his biography, and again, it's the life behind the famous photographs you might know, but how did he get from the circus to to the subway or to East 100th Street, or why, or the connection between, we're looking for these ways of opening up lives that kind of reveal the logic of a life. Because when you see just photographs on a screen, there's no context for how did she get there. So it's that kind of thing. Any other questions? Yeah, Carol. Oh, yeah, the mic.
You started talking a bit earlier about photography and the percent of women that are in photography today. And I'm going to be participating in a panel next week, and it's talking about how many women go into conflict photography, inverted commas. Conflict can be wars on the street and so on. And it's interesting that in my alumni, Central St. Martin's, 60% of the photography master's program are females. And then you say, look back, who actually stick to it? And I'm a member of the BPPA, and only 3% of the membership are female that are practicing working photographers.
What is the BPPA?
The British Professional Press Association here in the UK, but the AOP Association of Photographers here, and I'm only speaking the UK, even though this is broad New York accent, is also is less than 8%.
So you mean they drop out?
Well, that's the challenge, you know. I mean, Susan, you've been
60 to 3% is really
That's
depressing.
a lot.
It's depressing.
Yeah.
And what is the, you know, when you think of what Eve's life was and her challenges and going out there and not just breaking the glass ceiling, so to speak, but the adventuresome, the curiosity. What is the barriers now, and how do we break down?
I think Eve was in it for the long run, and I think what I see on the ground, because I still at my advanced age, I'm out in the field all the time. When the Arab Spring happened, there was suddenly a ton of young women photographers. But what was very disheartening for me was that they were babes who kind of saw beautiful Lara Logan on TV and thought, wow, I want to be that. And they didn't know the hard work that goes into it. So they kind of briefly covered Libya and then they disappeared. A lot of, there's plenty of fine women out there that are doing it, but I think when they realize how tough it is, how you've got to give up a huge chunk of your life, and that includes possibly a partner, a secure life, having children, having a family life, the loneliness of being on the road endlessly. They think it's very sexy and exciting, but when it comes down to it, it ain't. And Eve was in it for the long run. And I think there's a whole generation now that is weaned on everything's fast, We have cell phones. We can get Twitter. No one wants to read the New York Times. They want to read Twitter. She came from a generation where it took time. And I think that what you're saying about that percentage is so grim. And I don't know how we can change that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
How did she deal with aging?
Excuse me?
How did she deal with aging? Did she slow down willingly? Did she not slow down?
I think Frank can all I can say is I saw her Linny, it must have been a couple months before she died, and I used to go see her in the nursing home, and she was, I would say, she had back problems, she clearly had health problems, but she kept working well into her 80s.
Yeah, and editing with Lenny for longer than that. But she hated being as old as she became, or as unwell as she became. And for a very, very long time, fearing she wouldn't get work, she used to lie about her age in order to pretend that she was younger than she was.
Yeah, she got very angry at me. When I first met her, I said, "How old are you?" And she snapped and said, "You wouldn't ask a man that question." And I said, "Well, I would actually." And she wouldn't tell me. But we were born, but I'm not saying how many years apart, but I think, Frank, she dealt with aging pretty well, though, physically. Physically, she could get around. I mean, I don't know mentally if it made her gloomy, but she still could travel. She was still writing. She was still archiving. The In China exhibition in the 90s in London was a big deal, and she was still working on that.
The truth is in the archive. I mean, I was just looking, this list is the first page, so it ends in 85. But I think what's really interesting is the way we developed a kind of numbering system. So each year, then you have each story, which is a different number, and then your negatives, how many contact sheets in your frame. And that numbering system is very revealing. So in 19X, you would see how many stories she did. I don't have that here. I mean, it's a great question. I'm actually going to try and find out. I don't even know what the absolute last story. I don't know if you know.
I tried to get
that
her to
she
go to
photographed.
Algeria with me in 1992. And there's a
But
long
she
correspondence.
photographed long after 92.
She did, but she wouldn't. There was Linny. Do you remember I tried to convince her to go to Algeria in 92 and she didn't want to go because of her back then. So in 92 she would have been about, Frank? 80.
I think she went, well, 1997, she's back in Cuba, and she meets the woman that she met with Generation X, which was when she was much younger.
Yeah.
I don't know, photographers, they went around the world finding someone who was of a certain age, and then Eve went back in 97 to which was 43 years later, to find this young woman. So just as I'm randomly looking at the chronology, for me, the thing that has actually fascinated me beyond Eve is not just a woman in her 80s, but Elliot Erwitt, who's in his mid-80s, Bruce Davidson in his early 80s.
Cartier-Bresson.
Cartier-Bresson lived to 95.
Don McCullen.
I don't know how old Don
Don's in his...
Has he hit 80?
Don here is
He's
in
not
his
yet 80.
late 70s.
But thinking about what it is about photography in particular, which I actually think probably somebody's going to be doing neurological studies, because if you're organizing space and moving through space and thinking about the layers that you're working with as a photographer, I really do think there might be some correlation between that kind of activation of the brain. These are all, when I mention Elliot and Stu, you were Bruce, Eve, into their 80s photographing actively, or actively revisiting work that they had done and re-editing, which Elliot has done a great, you just were there doing that, Stu, no? I mean, revisiting work and re-evaluating work and contextualizing that work. I mean, they're not unique in that. There are many people who probably do.
But yet, Susan and I and Frank got an email a few hours ago from John Morris, who couldn't be here tonight. But I don't know if any of you know who he is, but John Morris was the photo editor of Life during D-Day in the immortal story of Kappa's photographs and the darkroom and the development going all wrong. And John is 98, I think, it's his 80th birthday party.
Yeah.
I live in Paris. He lives in Paris. I see him often. He is still so spirited and so, I mean, he's still a committed Democrat. He still believes in things. But I think one thing about photography that you have to, it's a much more physical job than writing. I have to carry around my computer and a sat phone, but photographers have to carry around a lot of gear, and consequently, a lot of them suffer from back problems or shoulder problems or neck. So that's another thing that goes into it. But anyone else? Isabel, you? Yeah. This is my son's godmother.
What was the process of making the book? I mean, how did you choose for so much or so many? Was the
so hard.
decision?
It was. I first started with the boxes at Frank's house up in the attic. I'm the kind of writer that does outlines, but I tried to make a brief outline of her life, and then I went to Yale, to the library, and it was just seeing, I think there were 64 boxes, 64. And when I say boxes, they were full of everything from her address books which were, worth money. The telephone numbers of people that she had were extraordinary, from Nureyev to Joan Crawford. Her letters, which, the very poignant ones to Frank, but also advice to her. She was a very good girlfriend, which I found very inspiring. She had a great circle of women friends who adored her, and she adored them, and she gave a lot to them. I don't know if any of you are here tonight, but she wrote letters to them when she was away, and so there were all those. Then there were things like the recipes, her the index cards of every story, her notebooks from every story, and then at some point she started using a typewriter. So there was all kinds of typewritten lists of things. it was really hard to pull, like, and especially what, which stories we'd focus on. And we decided to first start her with the Harlem work, her early work. And then we moved into the celebrity things because, frankly, let's face it, someone who could get Marilyn Monroe in the most vulnerable and raw, emotionally raw positions that Eve did is, a rare person. And then there were things like Joan Crawford. I mean, she had a photo shoot with Joan Crawford, and she showed up, and Joan Crawford was well over 50, and she was drunk. She had been drinking. And she took off all her clothes, and she said to Eve, "Photograph me." And Eve said, Eve had this great line in her diary, which was something like, "Over 50, the skin is not what it was," or something like that. And I'm not going to photograph you because it won't be good for your career. And Joan insisted. And Eve did photograph her, but she never published those photographs. And so there was stuff like that. Then later on, there were these, her portraits of Malcolm X. There was so much. So I think this, for me, as a biographer, and not a trained biographer, was really the huge challenge. I mean, how did we narrow it down to 35,000 words, and then leaving room for, we wanted to put in the contact sheets, we wanted to put in the index cards. It was really nerve-wracking, but it was very fulfilling. And really, it was fantasy of going up into an attic and finding boxes of someone's life and being allowed to just be as you want.
It's 194 boxes. She only went through the first 64.
I went to 65, and I
You got
almost
to 65.
went mad.
I mean, this is just from the archivist who worked, under Janine and with Janine, comprising 194 boxes of correspondence, which Linny packed individually, journals, tear sheets, negatives, contact sheets, photographs, audiovisual material, ephemera. And it was 1997 that she did do her last story, which was in Cuba. And she was 85. So she had, what Tessa says is that the first story is really 1950, the last is 1997. So 47 years of very active life. Another question.
Hello, Janine.
Hi, Chris.
As one of your oldest friends, I'd just like to say that I hope this doesn't disqualify me from saying what a blindingly brilliant conversation it's been between the two of you.
Thank you.
And I hope I won't embarrass you by
Never.
saying that you have obviously taken inspiration from Eve in many ways. One of which was that you asked me a few years ago to alter your age in your Wikipedia entry.
Whoa! Woohoo!
The reason that
Eve did.
But I have a serious question, which is actually something that arose from what the other speaker mentioned. You said that the photographers these days aren't getting paid enough. They're finding it very difficult to have the outlets for their work. And I wondered, just in terms of the practicality, what is the world like now for a freelance photographer? A little more detail, perhaps, about that.
That's Susan. That's Susan's work.
Well, it's next generation down that I worry the most about, actually, because, the assignment culture is diminished dramatically. Even my decade, right, when, thinking versus Eve being on Simon so we're talking about a freelance culture. I'm speaking about a freelance culture, not a staff culture. But we all know that, there's no photographic staff any longer with National Geographic. We know that many newspapers in America have cut their staffs completely. We know that there's a welcome to anyone who makes images by almost any media, and very often not paid for. So we're talking about a culture of free exchange and a culture in which it's very difficult to make a distinction between who one invites to have the eyes on the world, let's say, because the world has many eyes now, and eyes and iPhones. So it's a radically different environment. It's not to say that there aren't assignments. They're definitely shorter than they were. It's not to say that there aren't more grants, which practically didn't exist in the time that Eve was working. So when I mentioned the Magnum Foundation we give out 10 to 12 grants a year that are enough to really get your teeth into something. They're something like $10,000, I don't know what that is in pounds, which you really can go out and do a body of work in a 2 to 3 week period. That's what you would have been paid up through the 90s, maybe into the early 20s. When you look at the online culture, it's pretty discouraging. I mean, I don't know that people in the world that just click and surf, as it were, have any idea. But
we have to get back.
The New York Times Lens blog, they pay $350 for what would have been worth $3,500 in a magazine. And it's very important you know these numbers, because there may be a day where they don't need to pay anyone because there's so much content being produced. So young photographers are competing for prizes. Prizes very rarely give any money at all. Small grants, small foundations. The context is different culturally in the U.S., where there are a lot of small foundations that do support photography. Philanthropic support, meaning different than public. British, if you live in Holland, you're better subsidized than you are in Britain as a young artist. So it's a very tough environment to do in-depth work. I'm not talking about, just
but we have to,
moving around.
We have to, and John Owen, who's somewhere out there, will agree, we have to get back to doing long format, in-depth, old school journalism. I'm an optimist by nature, and I have to say that I think that it is coming back. I write for Granta. Granta is one of the few places that still does it. The Guardian, God bless them, have just launched long format, which is basically long pieces that they're running. As much as we've got Vice News and the HuffPost, and there are places to do it. So I really, every time I get someone who's very discouraged by it, I just say there are ways. You just have to be resourceful. To write my book about Syria, I had to, basically beg, borrow, and steal. I did get a small advance from the publisher. I think it was about a half what I got from my first book 20 years ago. But I got a grant from the Nation Institute. I got funding from someone else. I got funding from someone else. You just have to be much more resourceful and determined. But as long as we all kind of agree that this kind of journalism, photojournalism, is essential, and documentation, and what is it? It's the first draft of history. We have to have it. We can't let it die. I think there are ways to do it. It's harder. Thanks. Thank you.
On that cheery note, any other questions?
I would have just more or less one comment. I mean, what you're saying, like, for example, you got for your second book like half the one you got for your first one. And I think the problem for now...
Seventh book, I got half what I got from my first book.
But it's like that's the problem, for example, for now, for photojournalists or young emerging journalists, that you are... Because all the photojournalists are not anymore staff, so they are competing with you for the same grant. So if we as young photojournalists or go for a grant that gives us the possibility to do something in the world for 2 to 3 weeks, and you compete against someone like who's out there for 10, 15 years, had 15 exhibitions, that's something, just you don't have the portfolio, and they ask you like to send 30 images, and even if you have a great idea, in the end, most of the time, let's say you don't get the grant. So I think that's another thing, that we are all in one pool, and it makes it so much harder.
But don't give up. Don't give up. Keep going. You will get it. And try to find a niche. I think that's what I always tell people. Try to find a niche that is... Don't do Libya and Yemen and things that everyone else is doing. Try to do something in the UK, or try to think out of the box. Malaria or something. Foundation could support you. Just don't give up. And I guess don't think of yourself as competing with people like Susan or Alex Maioli, or you're...
What I would put it in a different... The grant process we have, in order to be realistic with the funds that we have, is a nomination process. So that means we publishers and picture editors from around the world nominating up to 5 people. So it's a pool of 100, and we are able to support about 10 with the funds we now have. I actually think it's quite honest in the sense that if you look at the names, it'll be interesting, and you can go on the Magnum Foundation website to see. I would bet that 10% are names that you know. I'd be really interested for you to look. In other words, yes, they are nominated, but they're also up against young, energetic, different, people working in different styles, etc. So the fact that experienced photographers face the same kind of crisis that emerging photographers, we have to respond to both, I think, to keep a language alive. Because really what the photographers give you is a kind of mentored environment in which they set standards that you also can see. So when you have, I would defend that. I don't think it's all about being under 30.
Susan,
We were just talking about Eve working at 80, 85, going back to a subject 40 years later. That's not what you're 25. So those are different kinds of ideas about how photography can be valuable socially. So I think we need that kind of mix. And we need that mix that's not just first world. If you look at the support we're giving, a lot is global south, people who have never had opportunities. So it's quite a broad array of
Susan, can I ask you a
would
question?
be 10 times stronger if we had 10 times more of the fun.
Why, we know the process to get into Magnum is very rigorous and tough, and it should be because you're the greatest. But why are there so few women?
Oh God.
But in Eve's day, it was Eve, Inga, and Cartier-Bresson's wife.
Oh no, but Martine
Why
Frank and Marilyn Silverstone, there were 5 women who up through a certain number of years would get together annually every year.
5 is
but
not a
well, now. Well, first of all,
Why
that's
so
always
few?
a kind of strange position to be in as someone who has tried to find the women for whom being inside a cooperative that is mostly male will survive and bloom. So I would say, Olivia Arthur, Bieka de Porter, people who you may or may not know. Olivia lives in London. But Eve is still, it's not the 5 who are living. Inga and Eve are as much a part of who we are. So I'm careful about that. I think finding the right, a community, people who belong find themselves in a community, feel they belong in a community. There are many women who I've approached who don't feel it's the right place for them. So I'm always hoping to find more place, as it were. In a way, the Magnum Foundation is the reverse, because the Magnum Foundation is not supporting Magnum photographers, it's supporting this larger community beyond the boundaries of who might be part of Magnum.
So you'll take other
I think,
agencies, people who are with other
the
agencies?
The grants have gone to people in Seven, in Newark, in completely unknown as well. They're not at all specific to Magnum. So if I wasn't clear about that, you can see that, the evidence of that on the site. The only thing that's actually still really specific in the foundation to Magnum is this legacy series. We're starting with Magnum. That doesn't mean it'll end there, but that's where it's beginning. That's the family history that we're sharing.
I want to ask just one question that you mentioned earlier, that Eve started her career at the age of 40. And what was the inspiration to jump off at the age of 40, probably married, I don't know, child, and so on? I'm now going to enter into this unknown.
She left Philadelphia, and she was working at a photographic processing plant in Brooklyn, and I think we have a photograph of it in the book. And she began this class with Brodovich, which, and I think it was a boyfriend, an old boyfriend, gave her a camera, gave her a Rolleiflex, and that kind of inspired her, and she began wandering around. She moved from Philadelphia to New York, and she began wandering around taking street photographs. And then she did this class with Brodovich, and she had an eye, she had a talent, although there were a lot of notes pointing out that the class itself was very tough and that the students were very competitive, and so it wasn't the easiest kind of experience for her. But she continued. You know, she was 40 and she had a small... Were you born when she started the... Yeah. You were newborn. So she had a newborn and she went out. I think she wanted to develop this part of herself. And she had been working in the photographic plant and she was promoted. You know, she was very clever and she'd been promoted to a managerial role. But she had a child and her husband was a toy manufacturer, and she created toys, and she then wanted more, and she went out and she was good at it, so she kept going and going, and then she fell upon Magnum, or Magnum fell upon her, and the rest is history. But you're right. I mean, quite extraordinary in 1950s for a 40-year-old woman who was considered over the hill in those days, and a woman and a housewife, a Long Island housewife with a newborn baby, to go take a camera and wander up to Harlem or to Long Island. She did this magnificent series on migrant farm workers, potato workers in Long Island. And, you know, to do this kind of work. And again, for me, it comes back to one word: curiosity. And that's, you know, as the biographer, it was the one thing that, in fact, I had it over my computer as I was writing. You know, curiosity. That's what drove her, I think.
So I think one last
One
question.
last question.
I wanted to ask practically, how did she fund that work, the early work, when I mean, it's a big leap to go from, it's hard work now as a photographer, but I'm sure it was quite hard then to make a living as well. So how did she make that leap from going from a course to Magnum, and how did she fund that early work?
I was very interested in that because I had the same issue. So for me, it was very important. Initially, when she was still married to Frank's father, she I think she was funded by him partially. She then moved to London when Frank was young, so that he could go to Vidal's, and then she was on her own. And she was very lucky that she did get this gig with the Sunday Times, which doesn't really exist now. But she still had to struggle, and she still had to, you know, she had very careful budgets, right, Linny? I mean, she really budgeted quite carefully. When you look at, she just submit budgets for projects before, and she really kind of broke them down. But I think the immediate leap was that she had her husband, and then she went to London, and they split up. And she was on her own, and I think that was very, very difficult to be a woman alone in London with a small child, having to work and carve out a career in an extremely male-dominated
world. Joining
world.
Magnum was really something significant in terms of what could be supported. In other words, the way the Magnum system, particularly very early on and through, I would say probably 2000, there was something called a distribution system. So Eve might do something on her own, like go up to Harlem. She would come back, and at that time it was John Morris, who's we were just referring to, who's in his late 90s now. An edit would be made. It would be sent to a couple of different magazines, not just in New York, but in Paris or in Germany, etc. So Magnum invented a very powerful machine for freelancers. It's not to say that other small agencies didn't do similar, but that was a means by which, if you reproduce your work in multiple settings, it feeds the future. If you can, so it was a very important thing that though she might be generating those herself, she might have been on an assignment, the editing and then moving, unlike writers, which is a big advantage photographers had through that period, because a writer would have to be translated and it was less likely to have happened, but photographs could live in multiple environments. So you'd have a German magazine using one set and a French magazine using a different set. One of the things we're really interested in is that her early distro system and how it was invented and kind of developed. I think at the point where I enter Magnum in 76, it's very much in place. In 55, early 50s, it's being created. And by the time Magnum's, I think today we probably, the last I knew the count, we had something like 20 agents in 20 countries. So each country would get the packet and then decide what to do with that work. And so a lot of what you see in this is publications, very different publications that she wasn't on staff for. Sunday Times maybe paid her to do a piece of work. When it went to Perry Match, she was paid for that work. That's why I mentioned this, the fact that there's such free exchange now, and there isn't the payment to photographers for the work that they've produced. Not only they're not getting to produce, there isn't the money to reproduce. Those two economic factors are huge for the freelance culture that, you know, and community that's trying to survive today. Well, copyright, we still fight very hard about copyright. And that's, you know, I think Magnum's real legacy is having fought that battle, but it continues to have to be fought because the people give up their copyright quite easily now.
Can we combine a writers cooperative with Magnum?
Yeah, actually there are a group of writers that have just created a cooperative, you know, around the same concept. Anyway, I think probably you're all ready for a drink at least.
Yes.
And we hope thanks.
And Susan and I will sign the book.
This is a very rare time to get Janine in one place with this book. So if you want Janine to sign this book, it's her book, and we're really Frank. I want to give you the first one.
Yeah.
So thank you.